Hi, and welcome to Behind the Scenes with Button Shy Games. My name is Tyson Mertlich, and today we're going to be talking about SpaceShipped, designed by Lucas Gentry. And it is my pleasure to bring Lucas Gentry to the table. How are you, Lucas?
I'm doing phenomenal.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you prefer Luke or Lucas?
When I'm talking with English speakers, I introduce myself as Luke.
Perfect. Well, Luke, it's such a pleasure to have you on today. I've been doing a lot of research on SpaceShipped and learning a lot more about it than I ever knew before. So I'm happy and excited to dive into this and talk a little bit to you about where it came from and what it was and the whole process.
Super.
So to start, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are, what got you into gaming, tabletop games, etc., and just the whole shebang.
Sure, sounds great. So, as a kid, my brother and I would play board games when we were not in school, like summer vacations. And at one point, maybe when my brother was going off to college, or maybe when he was in high school, he picked up Heroescape, big, huge box of large sprawling game, and apparently Walmart thought it was not going to sell, and they marked it down to like $7. And so he bought it, he brought it home, we loved it. He went back to Walmart, bought two more copies. They'd marked it down to $5 at that point, and so now we had three copies of this vast and overwhelming game. So we loved it, but it would take gonzo amount of time to get it set up before you can play. And so you'd end up spending an hour setting up the game and then play for a while. Once we got a little bit older, we still had fond memories of this game. However, once I would get it set up, no one wanted to play because I'd convince someone, yeah, let's play this game. It's awesome. And we get to be robots and samurais, and it's going to be so cool. And I'd convince them it's cool. And they'd be like, yeah, let's play. And so I'd set it up, and an hour would go by to set it up. And by then they didn't want to play anymore. And so that was sort of a bummer. Fast forward several years, I graduate college, I get married, we move to Costa Rica, and as we're getting ready to move, we downsize, and I get rid of my copy of Heroescape with the sad heart. Hopefully that this kid I give it to would be able to enjoy it as much as I did, but knew it wasn't worth keeping because no one would ever play it with me. And so we go off to Costa Rica, abandon Heroescape. Several years forward, several being maybe 3 in this case, I get the urge to play Heroescape again. I was like, I really want to play this, but I remember this terrible setup time, and I'm like, I don't want to play it really enough, but I really want to play it, if that makes any sense. And so I'm like, I'm going to design a new Heroescape that takes 5 minutes to set up and 5 minutes to tear down and fits in a box this big. And so I set out to do that. And I built this game. And instead of miniatures, just used tokens with a symbol on them. And instead of a big, massive board, used little modular tiles that would build the board. And they had little special ability powers on the different locations on the tiles. And so cool. And I never ended up actually publishing the game because the balance, the mire of all the balance was just too much. But it got me into designing these games. And in prototyping this game, I discovered the Game Crafter, which is cool. I discovered Tabletop with Will Wheaton, and I discovered the Dice Tower. And so my eyes were opened to cool things that could come from board games. I'm almost done, don't worry. And by this time, we're no longer in Costa Rica. We stayed there for 1 year. Then we moved to Texas, where we were teaching English, having a good old time. 1 year we came to Indiana, where my my wife's parents lived for some sort of holiday party, and I got Dominion for Christmas, and that was delightful. I still play that game. I've played that game within the last 7 days. We open presents. We mentioned board games. One of my wife's cousins turns out he's super into board games, and my wife volunteers the fact that, oh, Luke made this game, and he turns over and he goes, oh, what's your BGG username? And I said, what's that? And he says, come over here and bring your phone. And I said, okay. And so I went over there and he showed me Board Game Geek, and the rest was history.
And your doe eyes opened wide and you were just exposed into this massive world.
Exactly right. And so that was November of 2016 when I discovered Board Game Geek, and it was awesome.
Okay, so you've got a lot there that I'm super excited about. Personally, I love Heroescape. That was actually one of the first games that I started playing. I think they did a great job at being able to bring, like you mentioned, Walmart discounted it heavily. Yeah, it's because they can't really sell that game, but it's got like the Lego feel to it. So like I loved Legos as a kid because that whole setup, building it's exciting. It gives you the feeling of being a game designer without actually having to game design, because you're like, oh, but I can make this scenario and do that. There's so much amazing things I think about that game that is super exciting. So I can totally see where you came from. Interestingly enough, I bought that game like a year or two ago after I never owned it. I was the kid that you invited over and was like, oh, this takes too long to set up, but I love the setup. But so I never owned a copy until a few years ago when I bought it for $1 at a garage sale with Dominion, actually. So
nice.
Interestingly enough. So there is a lot of space for you to have developed experiences from this hobby, and I love that it came from some similar spaces that I did. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what exactly you enjoy most about games. Like, what do they, playing board games, what is the, versus like playing video games or something like that, what is the difference for you? Why board games?
Okay, cool. So several reasons. First reason is probably just the interaction with other people. I love people in general. Even though the game that I have signed is a solo game, I love multiplayer games more than playing just myself. I love interacting with people. I really love sort of putting myself in the perspective of the designer. Like, why did you do it this way? There's a game designer meetup group in Indianapolis that I go to every once in a while, and to watch the other designers when they build their games, and it's like, okay, so if you do it this way, oh, and there's that light that lights up when you figure out why they did what they did, and I just love that that burst of inspiration. The other reason sort of segues backwards into the interview that you did with Dustin, and that is that he mentions the technical, you made some connection about technical backgrounds in game design. For me, I grew up doing computer programming. Like when I was 7 and my brother was 10, we would be sitting over at my grandpa's house, and he had this, probably not going to mean anything. He had a TI-99 computer that you plug into the back of the TV, and you needed to program it before you could use it. And he had these books of computer code, and an idea of a good time for my brother and I when we would be over at his house is just typing in the computer code from these books into the computer to make it do some little insignificant thing. But it was a blast to us. So all these years I've had that hobby of computer programming, not professional, but just as a hobby. And I would just every once in a while get this urge. I need to program something. It would be so cool to just make something cool. And it turns out game design is essentially programming other people. And so ever since I started game design, that programming itch doesn't happen anymore. Like, I still enjoy it. If somebody at work says, hey, can you write a script that does such and such? I'm like, yeah, and I love it and I make it. But like, I don't have the craving because game design fulfills it. So I'm not sure if any of that made sense, but I'm excited to talk about it.
It makes perfect sense to me because that's exactly kind of my experience as well. Because programming, like that whole concept of taking something that is basically nothing and then putting these constraints around it, and these constraints basically facilitate the fun that you're trying somebody to have. It's this puzzly element that they're trying to solve these problems, and you're trying to solve the problems with like human interaction, and like taking that psychology and that programming of these two elements and trying to get them to work. I love that. I think that's such a great perspective. It's interesting also because specifically with like button shy games, your space is so small that like you don't have as many. You have a lot of those constraints, and so those constraints are so applied that it makes it really difficult to necessarily get exactly what you want out of that. So you have to figure that out. You're wearing a button shy shirt. We were on a button shy interview. Tell me a little bit about how you found out about button shy, because you mentioned you dove in, you found BGG, button shy. Where did that come into the mix?
All right, cool. So 2016, I found Board Game Geek. 2017, I joined my first Board Game Geek print and play game design contest. 2016, 2017, 2018, Button Shy had a Gen Can't contest. Like when Gen Con was going on, the people that weren't going to Gen Con had the online Gen Can't contest. And Button Shy had a contest, and it was 18 cards. I think you were also allowed to keep score on a piece of paper. I think those were the limits of this particular contest. I did not win this contest. Tussie Mussy and Seasons of Rice, two phenomenal games, won this contest. Seasons of Rice is in my top 10. I was going to get to this later, but I'll tell you first now. Why I Otter and Seasons of Rice are in my top 10 favorite board games of all times. Tussie Mussy is in my top 20. And so to be beat by those two games did not feel bad at all. 6 or 8 months later, 2019, and now by this time we've moved back to Indiana. I get this wild off-the-wall email from Jason Tagmeyer, and he's like, hey, so you know that contest that you didn't win? And I was like, yeah. And he said, well, we really like your game anyway. Have anybody else published it? Because we'd like to. And I was like, no, I've got some changes that I need to make because I've got feedback. Give me till Thursday. I'll have it for you. And he's like, okay. And so I sent him the updated version of it, and he decided to publish it. And it was awesome because I do not have art skills. Like my graphic design skills and my picture making skills are just to the point that you can tell what I was attempting to do. Like they are functional and no more. Like, and so to have me turn in, and I believe you've got a picture of what I turned in versus what they published, but to go from the just usable version that I submitted, and then Jason comes in, and one, he did awesome things. He was the reason why there's an enemy card, and so I give him, if you enjoy the game, he gets that credit of suggesting the enemy card, which I think adds so much to the game. But also, he got artists involved and did graphic design, and it just like I'm still astounded at how cool it is to have someone else take your work and make it so much better.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me mention that your Jason Tagmeyer impression is spot on. Um, I thought that was great. But no, absolutely. I love that whole idea of bringing a game and having somebody else appreciate it for what it is. You put all this effort in as a designer, and then somebody sees that, particularly a publisher. That's got to feel really exciting, right? That's got to feel like
It is exciting.
amazing. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what your experience or what your emotions were when you were like, "Oh, wait, I thought this game had lost, but they're still interested in it."
Yes. So I guess it was a strange situation. I can place myself within 3 feet of where I was when I read the email. I was sitting in the car in my driveway, just waiting for it to cool down because I had just been mowing the lawn and I was super hot. And I sat in the car like just to cool down for a minute, turn on the air. And so I just checked my phone. I was like, hey, this is cool. And I turn off the car and run over to my wife. This is what just happened. And she's like, good job.
So then,
But it was
for
cool.
for those who maybe just venturing into design, first time looking into this, they want that feeling that you're describing here. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who's just starting out, just looking into maybe how do I get to that stage? I want that feeling.
Okay, so my 2 big pieces of advice. One, try to make sure that there are consistent, good decisions. Like, if your decision doesn't matter, then that's not a good part of that game. And the second one that I learned because I didn't do it well enough is try to make it so there are as few exceptions as possible. And if you're making a card game in this particular case, if there are exceptions, make it so that the exception is just on the card. Because that's something that we experienced through the making of SpaceShipped. There is one card that, due to that card, we had to write exceptions into the instruction book. And so, like, if we could do it all over, we would change that card so we wouldn't need exceptions in the instruction book. And so the 2 main pieces of advice, make interesting choices, a lot of interesting choices, and make it so you minimize the number of exceptions in your design.
I think both of those are fabulous pieces of advice because essentially a game is the decisions you're making within it, right? And if you're not, if your decisions are obvious or your decisions are just kind of there for you and they don't give you any excitement about what you're going to do later on, then it feels almost boring. Like there's nothing to do there. So I think that's great. And the exceptions thing, I can't tell you how many rules I've read that I'm like, oh wait, I got to go back and this card means that, so I have to go back and check the rules. If I can minimize my time in that rule book, I feel like that helps keep that immersion of the whole experience I'm doing, right?
You want to just be able to like read the rules and be like, okay, this is what I'm doing, and then put the rules aside and play the game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So how many designs would you say you've worked on? Like how many published, unpublished, whatever, your whole repertoire worth of stuff. How many games have you had to go through to get to SpaceShipped essentially?
Okay, I think SpaceShipped was probably number 5. It was early on. I could be completely wrong. I do not have a very good memory sometimes. But out of the games that I can remember, it's like number 5. That being said, overall, but it's the only one that's signed, the only one that someone published. out in the wild, there's one more that I think other people still play, and that is a game called Card Capture. I still play it. It's used a traditional deck of playing cards, and it was in a 2018 solo print and play Board Game Geek contest, and it won like first place out of the traditional playing card games. And it's essentially a gateway deck builder using just a deck of playing cards. And it's as objective as I can be about it, I still think it's enjoyable, even though I made it. But those two are the only things that I've made that I think are like out and live that other people play. But that being said, I've made at least 24 games up to the playable prototype stage. And then I usually realize, well, this is too obvious what the next thing I'm supposed to do, or this isn't really that great of decisions I'm making. And so I scrap it and start over.
I love that you pointed out that you said early on, like your first 5 games, that's early on. SpaceShipped within that first 5 games, because I think it's like that whole Thomas Edison light bulb comparison. You have like 9,000 or 999 mistakes, and then you finally find the one that turns on the light bulb, right? I feel like design is a lot of that same process, that it's easy to think, oh, I have this amazing idea and it would make for a great game. But as you start working on it and developing it, you realize more and more, like you're saying, some of those decisions don't work out or what have you. It makes it so that you have this feeling that, oh, I'm never going to get anything to work. But I think it's important to note that a lot of people don't get a published design for a number of designs before. I mean, and like you said, 5 seems like early. That seems quick. I know me personally, I've done something like 10, 12 on the side, and nothing has been picked up yet. But that beside the point, it can take forever to get that. So I think it's great if anybody is out there interested in learning how to design, and don't get discouraged by not having your first design experience published. So,
and I would point out that I don't have aspirations of being a professional game designer. Like, my longtime goal is for this just to continue to be a hobby, and then I'll work at the library. So,
and I think that's important to note, because I mean, there's a lot of fun things you can do with game design, obviously, but designers don't often make tons and tons of money unless you're putting out stuff consistently all the time and it's always selling, which is a hard thing to do. All right, yeah. Let's spin back into SpaceShipped a little bit. And when you were designing SpaceShipped, what one major thing would you say you learned from specifically designing SpaceShipped that has helped your process? You sounded like you mentioned a few things, like maybe even Jason's implementing the villain character in SpaceShipped, the enemy, or some of the other things that you talked about, making the exceptions. But what's the one major takeaway that you could say that this is the big lesson I learned from designing SpaceShipped? And that may be
I don't know if that was on the original question list. I don't know if I have an individual, this is the one thing. I definitely learned a lot. I learned a lot about minimum viable prototypes, to be able to iterate and make a lot of changes, not to expect that what I'm doing is what I will be doing, and not to expect that anything that I put on the card will probably stay there. Like, there was a lot of balancing involved. Like, I designed all the encounters just so I would have enough encounters, and then put them into play, and then just see what happens. And then it turns out that doing this in combination with this will be too much something, either too overpowered, too underpowered, not worth doing, etc. So I move things around. I adjust values. I think if I do this, it's going to take away some of the questions that I need the player to face. This is something that I'd planned on saying on a different question, but SpaceShipped is all about this versus that. Like, it's all about, well, you can do this, but if you do this, it'll be worse for that. And so, like, there was a player on the Discord within the last week or so that was talking to me about SpaceShipped, and they said, whenever I play, I always try to buy a lot of the asteroids, because this player noticed that on the back of the asteroids are usually the worst events, like the things that you most don't want to happen to you. Those are on the back of the asteroids. I wouldn't have revealed that information except for a player mentioned that they had noticed it. And so their strategy was, I'm going to buy and sell a lot of asteroids and try to make my profit through those. But there's a give and take. If you buy and sell from a lot of these asteroids, then you have a lot less profit opportunity, because you're using these, they'll only be valuable from 1 to 3, whereas some of these other resources, you can get a lot more profit. So if I make this decision, then I'll keep myself out of some danger, but since I'm not making profit fast enough, then the villain's going to probably win. My ship won't get destroyed, but I'm using all this time making not much money, and so the villain ends up stealing the crystals out before you. And so there's all these gives and takes. You can play it very safe and lose one way, or you can play it very risky and lose a different way. And so you have to make a lot of adjustments and a lot of decisions on how you want to play. And just that give and take is something that I'm really happy about with SpaceShipped, and that idea of this versus that is something that I try to carry on to other designs.
No, I think that's excellent. I think SpaceShip does that really well, and that give and take. I think one of my favorite mechanics conceptually is the market mechanic, and I love that, like, as you describe that to me, I can see where those values of the asteroids are, and knowing that those asteroids sell for the least, typically. I mean, you can get some profit out of them, but that has appeared to me to be early game strategy. But then you go in and you make those gives and takes. I love games that give me that option, and that there's multiple paths to victory, essentially, within SpaceShipped, except the question is it right for this situation? Because I love the variable setup, and I love the concept of making it so that every game is going to be different, and you have to adjust to each event, which is a tough thing to do in a space of 18 cards, right? Like, the fact that you put randomized events in there, and they're not like it's 18 events, but essentially the way they come out and the way they interact with others is where it becomes exciting. So I love that kind of give and take mentality, because it is something that good games do well at if I do this, I'm giving up this option over here. However, that may be the most beneficial to me in this current situation based off of everything surrounding it. So I really like that you've done that. It makes me wonder a little bit about the whole concept of SpaceShipped, where you came up with the idea for it. What was your source of inspiration about SpaceShipped? Like, why SpaceShipped?
Okay, so when I first sat down to make the game, I was just flipping over cards on the table. Just, I could have a thing where I can rotate from this field to that field. That'd be interesting. And I can just trying to imagine how many different uses that I can have for a card without cluttering everything up, essentially. And so I had the cards flipping around the table before anything else. But once I realized that it's going to be going from place to place, then I thought back about this Space Trader game from the Palm OS. So, like, Palm Pilot, 20 years ago, was a little personal planner that you could put your phone numbers in and dates and times and stuff. Very, very simple as it comes to computers. Um, about the brain power as a flip phone, maybe less, depending on your flip phone. And you could put games on that Palm Pilot, Palm OS. And one of the games that I loved was called Space Trader. And if you have an Android phone, they have Android applications of this same game, so you can still play it. I still play it every once in a while. But Space Trader, you've got a ship, you're going from planet to planet, you're experiencing different events, you're buying low, selling high, you're getting attacked by criminals, you're running in with the police. Like, the only thing that wouldn't fit into the 18 cards is battles. But everything else is in there from that Palm OS inspiration. And so very much inspired by that game. Obviously not a clone, but it's if you play that game, you'll definitely see where a lot of things were inspired.
I I love that's one of the things that I love about games is hailing back to things that were nostalgic. You talked
Mhm.
about your you playing on the TI-99 and have designing games on there and things like that. And I love the feelings I felt as a kid playing with those types of things. Atari playing with all these older versions of games or older applications, the Snake game, the whatever it might be. And I love pulling sources of inspiration and then expanding on that. Like I think we see that in like even movies and things like that where you've seen a lot of like they make Battleship the movie. They make what was the Adam Sandler one with giant Pac-Man pixels, right? They make pixels because of the nostalgia of the 80s and the video games and
Yeah,
90s and all that
all the
stuff.
Wreck-It Ralph.
Exactly, all that stuff. I love that. That's one of my favorite types of genre. So that makes me excited to hear about that and know that that's one of the sources. But it's impressive because those types of games are also like they're a small space, but they pack a punch. We talked a little bit about this already, but 18 cards is a very small space to design in. But you've with Spaceship, you've packed a lot in. Like I mean, one side of the card has three different functions, which also interact with a ton of different things. The other side of the card has a couple of different functions of what you can buy. You can have your ships. You can have a dozen different things, crew members, etc. So it gives you this interchangeability, this variability, and customizability that is really impressive for an 18 card game. So I'm curious, as you were playing through this, as you were designing it and developing it, what types of obstacles did you run into and realize that's just not going to work? Or maybe we've got to find a solution because there's a better way to do this.
So the very first time, the very first prototype that I made, it did not have the solar winds that lets you reshuffle everything. And instead, and this is terrible, but it's the truth. Instead, after every turn, you just shuffle everything up and lay everything back out. And so, like, half of your time was not making decisions. It was just shuffling the cards and laying them back out. And it worked really well to randomize all the things like I wanted, but it was not an enjoyable aspect of the game. And so I was sitting in the basement working on this, and my wife wanders over and she's like, why don't you just make it so like one card goes from here to over there and then it goes over here? I was like, that works really, really well. And so
Why am I interviewing you? Should she be here instead? Is that what I'm understanding?
well, she's probably the more clever of the two of us. But so she had that idea, and Jason had the idea of the villain, and so I'm just like in the middle trying things. But overall, it worked out. So
I think that you bring up a point that may not get discussed all the time, and when talking about production of a game, is that yeah, there is usually one, maybe two designers, but the production of a game is not like contained within the one designer alone. There's the art, there's the production team, there's development, there's playtesting, there's a number of different people, and so a good designer knows where to pull from those sources and how to get others to help them to do it. I mean, playtesting is an obvious instance of this, right? It's an obvious thing that without playtesters, games aren't going to really be able to be made. Even when this is a solo game, I imagine there was a fair amount of playtesting that had to go into it. What kind of a playtesting experience did you have with this game, with showing it to other people and yourself?
There are two main places that I sought advice. One was just a print and play Facebook group, and that's when Martin got connected. Martin Gonzalez. He's getting more and more popular all the time in the print and play world. He played it. There was a guy named Mark that was one of the admins of the print and play group, and he's like, "You've got a game in here." And I was just like, when he said just those words, "You've really got something here," I was like, "Hey, maybe I've got something here." But introducing it with that print and play group, and then some people on a work in progress page on Board Game Geek were a lot of the initial feedback that came from. And then there were changes made during production, after signing but before printing. There were some changes made from feedback on the Discord even. So even as late as after signing, there was still feedback that could be worked to make the game better. Hailing back to a previous question about advice to a new designer, though, 18 card games are so much easier to get a playtester willing to play if they only have to print 18 cards worth as opposed to 108 or 54 even.
Absolutely. And whether or not you're trying to make it a more professional endeavor, or if you're just doing it for a hobby endeavor, 18 cards is a good place to start because it gives you that kind of design chops. It gives you the experience that you need to kind of know how to design games a little bit better. And I think that that's great. And on top of that, I think you kind of hit a double whammy on this, because you've got 18 card games and you've got a solo game, meaning that you can test it on your own without anybody else, which is probably a very valuable thing to have, because you at least know how it performs perfectly with the target audience, because you yourself can be that target audience. With the whole concept of it being a solo game, I know that both solo and cooperative games have the tendency to try and be very difficult. What would you say, how often do you want, or how often do you think people typically win this game?
So I'm not sure how often other people win it. I probably... So there is a combination of cards that if you start with it, your ship is just destroyed. And that's I don't consider that a loss in my loss categories, because that's just like, okay, I need to realize that there's a lot of danger out here. I need to upgrade my ship pretty quickly. So if that happens, just shuffle it, restart. So discounting those on turns, on games that I survive more than a couple turns, I'd probably say I win about 3/4 of the time, maybe 70%. When you add in cards from the expansions, especially when you add in some of the harder enemies that are coming with the expansions, that percentage goes down. I don't win as often. That being said, so far, I have not found a particular set of cards that were impossible to win. Some combinations of base game and expansion cards are definitely harder than others, a lot more challenge than others. But whenever I'll shuffle them together and start a game, if I don't win, then I'll start with that exact same mix of cards just to make sure that I'm not creating unwinnable situations, even though I know sometimes I'm creating very difficult to win situations.
I think that's good though in a solo game, is having some situations in which it's very difficult to win, but at least it gives you the feeling of, I think I can win that. But when it's completely unwinnable, that's not the greatest feeling, right? So
yeah.
I wonder if there's any like unique or interesting tidbits or Easter eggs regarding Spaceship that you could maybe share with us.
So I already gave this one away earlier. The main one that I was wanting to point out was the fact that every decision you make is going to help you in one way and hurt you in another. And so when we pointed out the negative events being more likely to happen on cheaper resource cards, there's sort of a flow to the game where early on you need to use the time that you have at the beginning to upgrade so that you can be able to survive once you start buying the more expensive resources, because the less expensive resources that you didn't buy are going to come and destroy your ship.
No, and I love that idea because, again, it goes back to what we talked about before, that interesting trade-offs that you get, kind of, do I do this knowing full well that it slows down some of these difficult things or not? And so I love knowing those intentional decisions made in the design process to help to see what I'm seeing and being like, oh yeah, they did this because they know if I do this, this will happen, or more likely to happen. I mean, another thing that I think is interesting is along those lines is that as you're buying from that market row, as you pull down some of those cards into your inventory, so you get a ship with a larger hold and you get more cards into your hold, that also expedites the amount of time that those cards are going. So it's, again, this trade-off, and I love that.
Speeds up the crystals running by.
Yep. And so it's this whole, wait, do I want to have fewer things in my cargo hold right now because I know it's going to give me a little bit more time to build it up? Or do I buy a lot of things and sell them quickly so that I can get that money, so that when those crystals come, I can purchase them right then and there and not give them over to the bad guy, the villain. So I think there's a lot of interesting things about that give and take, and I think SpaceShipped has done a good job, and I like that was completely intentional of the whole give and take mechanic of it. So in this last little bit, I like to ask some fire questions just so people can get to know you better as a person and as a designer.
Okay.
And a little bit of like lightning round questions. So I'm just going to ask you some quick questions and just want your quick responses. So just to start, let's go ahead and see. What is one of your favorite border card games? You mentioned some already, but what is your favorite?
Okay. My favorite Pathfinder adventure card game is essentially takes the experience of playing a tabletop role-playing game and somewhat turns it into a card game that you can play with other people or solo. But the main thing I like about it is the fact that it feels that progression that you would normally feel in a role-playing game. I'm also a big fan of sci-fi games like Terraforming Mars and Race for the Galaxy.
No, good choices. I love all of those. Haven't played that much Pathfinder, unfortunately, but yes. How about...
It's not for everybody.
No, it's not. But that's the great thing about games. Everybody can find what they want, right? Other than border card games, what other hobbies do you have?
I love culture, but I specifically don't mean pop culture. I love seeing how language influences culture and how culture influences language. I love word origins, etymology, and language learning. I'm only conversant in English and Spanish, but I absolutely love the learning because the more that you learn about these things, like it lets you be able to see the world in different ways. And just to have these new perspectives just blows my mind, and I love it.
I absolutely love that. I think that in every walk of life, the more you know about more things, more cultures, more experiences, the better you are to relate, going to be able to relate to players. So if you're a game designer, that helps you understand and relate better with more of your audience. And if you're just a normal person, like you get to experience and empathize with people more. And I think we need more of that in the world. So I think that's great. What is a unique talent that you have?
I don't think I have any unique talents, but I have some favorite talents because most of the talents that I have, I know other people that also have those talents, and so nothing really unique. But one of my favorite talents is translating. I mentioned that I love language. When we lived in Costa Rica, there was an opportunity for my mom and my sister's parents to come down. And so on Sundays, we would go to church, and it was all in Spanish. And so my parents and her parents don't speak Spanish. And so we would sit in the back, and like the pastor's speaking, and we're like trying to translate on the fly and to be able to like facilitate communication through being able to see from multiple perspectives is just thrilling. After Costa Rica, we lived in Texas. I was teaching English, but I was also working at a farm and ranch store, and we had a lot of our customers that were Spanish speakers. And until I got to the point that I knew the answers, I would basically just be that go-between in between the customers that had questions in Spanish and the workers that had answers in English. And I got to like be between them and transform this question into something that this person can understand and change this answer into something this person can understand. And just to be that conduit for communication is just a blast.
In spite of what you said, I'm going to say that is a unique talent. Not many people day to day act as translators in their regular lives. So I'm going to say that's a unique talent, and it qualifies.
Okay,
so,
I will take it.
So we'll count it. Well, Luke, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. It's been a pleasure to chat with you and learn a little bit more about SpaceShipped and about you, and I really enjoy it. If anybody wanted to find you, anybody wanted to chat with you, where would they go? What are some good ways to get in contact with you and see what you're working on and that type of thing?
Okay, the easiest ways are going to be the Button Shy Discord, because I'm there all the time. If you post something in the SpaceShipped channel, I will see it. Or if you tag me, I'll see it. Or Twitter. My Twitter handle, I think, is L Gentry Design. It could be Designs. I always forget, but it's one of those two. LGENTRY DESIGN, maybe an S at the end. Those two are the easiest ways to get a hold of me.
I think if you find one, you'll find the other. So
probably.
Again, it's been a pleasure. We appreciate having you on, and look forward to seeing what else you work on and everything else.
See you later.
Thanks, everybody, for taking the moment to join me with Luke and learn a little bit more about SpaceShipped. If you want more information or want to get a copy yourself, feel free to check out the Button Shy website, and you can get a copy there. Any questions about this or any feedback on what we're doing here, please let us know through the Button Shy Discord server or the Button Shy Twitter account, and hope to see you again.